My apologies to those of you who are online. We're 20 minutes behind schedule, but we'll, as I said earlier, try to catch up. I'm mindful one of the speakers, I think, or colleague from the FAO will need to leave in about 30 minutes. So we'll make sure we do some slight adjustments, sir, so that you can have the opportunity to talk and respond to some of the questions before you have to leave us. And for the others, we'll push it until maybe a quarter past one, half past one, if needed, and limit the lunch break to a full hour, which should be fine. We're being served right over there. So we're moving to the second thematic priority that we have selected for this 7th edition for the Roundtable, which is on the topical issue of financing that localization of the SDGs, an issue that is of primary importance for two main reasons. First, because as we heard in the opening remarks of the morning, local and regional governments discharge a significant share of public spending and public expenditure that goes to SDGs related public policies and areas, and especially in the OECD countries. And on the other hand, and that's the flip side of the coin, because we often hear that one of the main challenges that local and regional governments are facing is actually access to finance and how to leverage public investment to have more blended finance and achieve some of the goals. So we'll try to unpack the black box of financing to understand the main challenges at play and some of the interesting thinking that is ongoing in this area. And one of them is actually led by a commission that was set up by SDSN, a Global Commission for SDGs Urban Finance, which is supported with the excellent secretariat work by Professor Eugenie Birch, who's also the co-director of the Penn Institute for Urban Research within the University of Pennsylvania. We're very pleased and honored to have you with us, Jenny, and we'll give you the floor to set the scene for a 10-minute keynote, and then we'll move to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and good morning still to you all. This has been a really fascinating morning so far. Now we bring you news of maybe much fascination, but less optimism. We'll just put it that way. Next slide, please. So 5 years ago, the OECD was looking at development partners and who was doing this, and they described it as an anthill of many, many characters. And so today we want to talk a little bit about this anthill, and so let's come to much more order. As you look at that globe and you see that bright, shiny sun on the other side, looking at the future, let us see if the future is going to be so shiny for all of us in the subnational situation. Next slide, please. A lot of work has gone on in this period, particularly by the OECD, in terms of working on how to think about financing the SDGs, developing toolkits, figuring out what kind of data is needed. And it's a tremendous, tremendous resource that has been brought to bear on this question of how to align the SDGs with local finance. And I reference many of these studies that you see on the screen today. The next slide, please. So as we've already heard many times, that 65% of the SDG targets relate to subnational investments, particularly in cities. We've also heard this terrible news that 15%, only 15% are on track, 48% are showing insufficient progress, and 36% are stagnant or regressing. And you can see in the graphic that comes from the recent study by UNDP, where the financial piece of all of this is lying, that the expected annual contribution for the implementation of the SDGs ought to be around $4 trillion a year. And in particular, there are specific SDGs that are commanding a good deal of resources that they're not receiving. These are in particular the energy, 7, and infrastructure, which actually covers many of, I'm using infrastructure in a broad sense, it covers many of the SDGs, as you know, whether it's hard infrastructure such as transportation and buildings, or whether it's soft infrastructure, looking at education and social issues, that too is commanding the most of the resources, but is not receiving those resources. So we have a lot of work to do in trying to figure out how to get those resources to the SDGs. The next slide, please. And there are some explanations for where and what the problems are that we just discussed. In particular, a beautiful survey that was done by OECD and SDSN last year demonstrated that there are things that can and need to be done to bring these resources to our cities and subnational governments. And we see here the leadership of many of these places, as you've spoken this morning, as mayors and state leaders and so forth, are leading the way in advocating and lobbying for the finances. But we need to be thinking of new kinds of financial instruments, opening up the global financial architecture so it does appreciate and bring resources to cities. And of course, we'll have some recommendations from the commission that Aziza just mentioned. Next slide, please. So let's take a few minutes to try to look at the complicated landscape of finance for the SDGs and where subnational governments and cities fit in. Next slide, please. So here we are. Up at the top in the pink, you see this issue of the needed amount of money that's needed, $4 trillion. And usually people talk about two kinds of sources of that money. One source, of course, is ODA, the development fundings that come from governments and from the multilateral development banks. And the other source is usually discussed as climate finance. And they are often discussed separately, where in reality, they really do and should be more cooperative. We did have a report from the IPCC in which the observers thought maybe we ought to be talking about climate resilient development when we talk about climate change, or we should be talking about sustainable finance when we talk about the SDGs. In other words, we really need to be thinking about bringing these two sources of funding together because they have co-benefits and ought not to be talked about as separate streams. But we know that we've received from all of them about and the whole level of funding somewhere between maybe $500 million annually are going into these two areas for SDGs and for climate change and so forth. That's nowhere near the trillions of dollars that are needed. So who are the actors in providing this funding? We have public actors, we have private actors, and we have philanthropy. When we look at the public sector, of course, we look at governments, we look at the multilateral development banks, we look at bilateral agreements and so forth. When we look at the private sector, we look at commercial banks, we look at investment funds, we look at all sorts of investors who might be involved in the various sectors. And when we talk about the private sector in terms of the SDGs, we really have to realize that there are many different decisions that go in depending upon the sector. It's one thing to invest in transport. It's another thing to invest in energy. It's another thing to invest in health. And each one of these sectors has its own sort of rules, its own sort of needs for the rate of return for investments. And in order to really activate these, we have to have a deep understanding of the motivation of these sorts of things. And of course, philanthropy comes in to assist in innovation or to assist in other sorts of things. And also, I'd like to point out, we need to be thinking about two streams of income when we talk about finance, paying for the SDGs. One is finance, which is gathering the capital to make the investments, and the other is the word funding, which is gathering the capital to keep those investments running, the operational costs. And so there are two areas that one has to think about as well. When we think about the public and private sectors and the fact that they are making investments, and the public sector, by the way, has to raise its money, particularly when you talk about the multilateral development banks. I'll take the World Bank as an example. The World Bank has what's called a AAA rating by the ratings agencies, and it has that kind of rating because it gathers its funds in two ways. It gathers its funds first by what's called callable capital. Every nation who's part of the World Bank pledges a certain percentage of GDP that will be make available in the event of default of the loans that the World Bank makes. That constitutes a very small fraction of the funding that the World Bank gets. The majority of that funding comes from the World Bank going out on the capital markets and raising that money through bond issues. It raises that money, uses that money to make its loans, and it needs to make sure that those loans are not defaulted on, because that is how it maintains its AAA rating. That, in a way, does explain the proportion of what's called concessional loans, those with low interest rates, and non-concessional loans, those which are at near market rates in terms of what the World Bank can do and decisions that it makes. All the multilateral development banks operate in this manner. When they're looking at these sorts of things, then they have to adjust the concept of risk. And there are all kinds of risk when making investments, whether it's the private or the public sector. There's the foreign exchange risk. Many loans are made in dollars because it's a more stable currency and not as volatile in terms of its value of dollars or euros. When they're made in local currency, there can be a lot of volatility, and that means there'll be a difficulty in paying back the loans themselves. There's also project risk when loans are made for projects that don't work out. That's a problem. And of course, political risk if there's some sort of issue with regard to where that is happening. All of this is reflected in the interest rate that a loan commands. And as you all know, if you have personal bank accounts or personal investments, interest rates have gone up dramatically in the past year or so as a result of a couple of things. In 2010 and 2008, we had the international monetary crisis. And then, of course, COVID put tremendous strains on government and investment, all causing the interest rate to rise. And so this, of course, is affecting what's happening with the SDG finance at all levels, local, national, and regional. The kinds of tools that are used, I've mentioned already. We have concessional and non-concessional loans. We have bonds. We have shares. And we can have them bundled into different sorts of projects. There could be project-oriented kinds of loans. There could be syndicated activities. There can be guarantees and so forth. And then there are areas where the funding can go. It can go directly to national, local governments. The difficulty, as you probably know, as local leaders, that often one needs to have a sovereign guarantee if one is going to see some head shaking, if one is going to obtain a loan. And sometimes sovereign guarantees don't work out because the national government doesn't feel that the local desire is in its interest. And this has to do with how the national government, of course, has to report its own debt situation to the IMF and its credit ratings, or there may be some dissonance between a local political leader and a national political leader, and the national leader is not interested in providing the guarantee. At any rate, these provide barriers to localities in terms of their receiving the funding that they might need through these kinds of sources of money. Of course, I forgot to mention grants. There are lots of grants out there as well. Not only can the financing go directly to governments, whether it's national, regional, or local, it can also go through various kinds of entities that may be set up, a special purpose vehicle for which the revenue stream is very defined and therefore seems to be a good risk, or it could go through a PPP, a public-private partnership. I'm sure many of you have engaged in those sorts of things. So who are the recipients? The recipients obviously are national governments. Recipients can, in some instances, be subnational governments, and we discuss the issues with regard to what's happening there. Right now, there's a huge discussion going on about how the multilateral development banks and the global financial architecture ought to be changed to more align with the SDGs and the climate initiatives we have at the global level, but also to bring more capital into the situation. Bringing more capital into the situation has to do with, number one, finding ways for the multilateral development banks to raise more capital, yet still keep their ratings. And number two, in the big discussion that's been going on recently, of course, has been how to get the private sector to invest in these areas, because there's no way, there's not enough money at the public level to support what's needed for the SDGs. That brings us back to that little box on risk. Private investors are very reluctant to invest their money if they don't think they're going to get the rate of return that they need to get. And therefore, some of the innovative kinds of activities that are being developed right now revolve around the idea of blended finance. Blended finance means where public and private entities get together on a loan, and the public entity is able to take some of the risk, is able to provide some of the capital so that the cost of the money can go down, the interest rate can go down. And another discussion that's going on right now is around the area of guarantees, creating funds that might guarantee against default on a loan, whether it's concessional or non-concessional. So these are kind of some of the discussions that are occurring. Next slide, please. So right now, there's happening, and there will happen a year from now, the Finance for Development Conference #4. And the report that you see here on the screen is a very thorough report looking at the various needs and the various questions, the 4 questions that the conference will ask in great detail. The main questions are critical ones that we would know how to get more money, basically how to get more money for development, yet leave no one behind. When one reads this report, you'll see there's very little mention of subnational finance. In fact, it's only mentioned with regard to previous agreements of conferences of this, the 3 previous ones, but there's nothing forward-looking in this in terms of what ought to be thought about in the future for financing development. And this is where the advocacy of OECD, of you yourselves, through your networks, and from other kinds of activities that you're doing will become very valuable in the future. Next slide. So there are things that are happening as groups are preparing for these international convenings. As you know, there will be the Summit for the Future in September in the United Nations. It's going to be a look back at what we need for development. They've created a declaration. The most recent revision was issued on May 14th. And a couple of things were in here that are important to our discussion today. One of them is a recognition. There are 52 action items, and this goes on, but basically for us here at this discussion, there's the recognition that local authorities ought to be included in United Nations intergovernmental activities. This has been a long-going debate as to how and when and why they might be included. And as you probably know, there's a tremendous amount of blockage at the member state level for local participation in any of the decision-making. And there are several items on the need to reform the global financial architecture, such as some of the things that I was mentioning earlier. The second big convening that's happening, of course, is the G20 in November in Brazil. And previous to that, there's been a number of meetings, one of which I'd like to bring your attention to, because this is an area that I think you in this room could get involved in more with more intensity. And that is in the support of public development banks. There are 500 public development banks around the world, and they're the ones who know very well what is happening at the national, regional, and local levels. They're the people who are in the countries who are talking to you or involved with you, and this is a very, very strong group that we need to be supporting as we can continue to fight for more finance for local governments. And they had their meeting last week in Rio and come up with a declaration, which they're going to be lobbying the G20 to hope to get some of this recognition of the kinds of things that need to be done for getting more finance to localities. As you can see, those are some of the items on that list in front of you. The next slide, please. So as it was mentioned earlier, the SDSN, of which OECD is a part, created a year ago the Global Commission on Urban SDG Finance. It is co-chaired by Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, and of Eduardo Paes, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, and of Jeffrey Sachs, the economist. This group has 12 plus mayors in it from the largest cities and cities of all sides around the world. It has more than 90 members divided into 6 task forces that are working very hard on creating recommendations to be brought to the international convenings and other things that we're talking about. So let me give you a few words as to the 3 initiatives that they're following right now. More will come. The next slide, please. The first and perhaps the most developed of the activities is the recommendation and the detailing of a Green Cities Guarantee Fund. This is an effort, as we've mentioned before, to crowd in public and private finance better and directly to cities. This is we are working on this right now with CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, with other experts in this, particularly GCOM and C40, to detail what such a thing would look like, where it would be located, how it would be capitalized, what would be the structure of this whole thing. So stay tuned. There'll be more details of this in a few weeks. Next slide, please. The second thing is convening the groups that are working on city platforms or city project portfolios. If we're going to get the kinds of global financial reforms that we're looking for and get more attention from the funders, multilateral development banks, right down to the private sector, we need to be thinking at the city level and systematically at the city level, the whole range of things that are needed to express and define the kinds of finance that are needed for various projects that we have. And the last thing that we're working on is helping inform, next slide, please, helping inform the special report for the IPCC. As you may or may not know, between its cycles of reports, the IPCC does several special reports. This time they're doing only one, which is on cities, and we are helping them think about how to get finance into that report, because in the past, those scientists who think about glaciers don't think very much about money. I don't mean to depreciate them, but we need to get them to think about money for cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Last
so
slide,
much.
please.
Yes, please do. Thank you very much, Jenny, and we'll swap the order of interventions, and I now call upon Stefanos Fotiou, who is the Director of the Office of Sustainable Development Goals within the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which, as Shipra said this morning, is co-chairing Local 2030. You have the floor, Director, for your intervention, and after that, maybe we'll pause a little bit to take some questions in case you have some for Jenny or for Stefanos, and we'll continue with the next round of speakers. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I was really impressed by the presentation of Jenny, especially when she gave, all these instruments that are available. And I would like to start by a message that a lot of effort is happening right now. So the financing for the SDGs and the financing, especially go to the cities, really we need to focus on the concessional part, on the concessional loans and the concessional financing, because we see many times that there's a disambiguity about the numbers. So I get the 4 trillion figure there, but I really am asking always the finance experts, is this 4 trillion figure includes the 1.5 trillion that is needed for the energy transition? Is it including the around 650 billions, I think, that it's included for the biodiversity conservation? And if this is included, we need to make very sure what are the numbers we're communicating, because we have been in a trap in the sustainability agenda that we approach it from a cost perspective, that sustainability is costing, but we don't see the benefits. And I think this is a little bit problematic. So let me try in the next 3-4 minutes to address two questions. What are the barriers for financing SDG localization, and what we do with our colleagues in the UN Habitat and the joint UN SDG Trust Fund to actually focus on what I call the consensual financing and on the localization. So I would say that there are 5 barriers for me. One is the resource scarcity. So there's a revenue opportunities that they are not used right now. And I have in front of me a figure. I hope my colleagues, they have checked the figure saying that in developing countries, cities are raising only 20% of their own revenue potential. The second one is, of course, that we have limited institutional capacity that it can really support local governance structures to get the financing. There are, as a third element, the coordination challenges, and especially the lack of alignment between national, local policies and tools that they result on a fragmentation of actions. And I would like to put another challenge, which is sometimes the non-alignment between the demand for infrastructure, the infrastructure for which the cities are responsible to build, which is usually nothing, and the infrastructure that the cities are responsible to maintain. So we have a lot of cases that the national government will finance local level infrastructure, but then will ask from the cities to maintain this infrastructure without having the funding. And last but not least, we have insufficient SDG data monitoring, I think, and this absence of data, it's really hindering a lot of opportunities for a better approach. I do remember in a previous life when I was in UNEP, we were with a group that we were putting together the World City Data Council, and there are also specific methodologies now on how we can measure the data that they have to do with SDGs in the cities. So that's when it comes to the challenges. When it comes to the local 2030 coalition contribution to the financing of the SDG localization, let me say 2 things. One is that there is in the joint SDG Trust Fund a specific allocation right now that it was launched very recently, I think a couple of months ago, of 10 million funding round, that it has a focus on supporting SDG localization in around 25 or 27 countries, if I remember well. So this objective of this funding is to fund catalytic activities that they clearly demonstrate the role of the SDG localization. And these activities, hopefully, they will help the countries and other actors to go for the much bigger money. So the joint programs, because this the joint SDG fund is financing joint programs between different agencies, will enable a swift and collective UN response to accelerate the SDG localization portfolio through intervention in the areas that the local 2030 coalition is focusing, which is advocacy, action, and monitoring. On this, I want also to say that, excuse me, in addition to the portfolio, the SDG Trust Fund has created, in coordination with the local 2030 coalition, the so-called SDG localization marker. And the SDG localization marker, actually, it's going to be an indicator that it will be applied in the other financing windows of the fund, because we have financing window on on food systems, on energy, on digitalization, and from the piloting of the SDG localization market, we have seen the important utility in identifying and tracking key SDG localization activities across all the areas that they are covered by the joint SDGs fund portfolio. So from the one side is to provide the catalytic funding, but from the other side is that all the catalytic funding that is going through all the windows, and the windows are focusing on the 6 main transitions, are really getting a localization approach. On this, I must say here that many times the central planning is having a perfect plan, But when we go to the local implementation, things are not happening. And I think things are not happening because many times there's no a specific delegation of budgeting authority to the local level and to the municipalities. So I do hope that with our combined efforts with improving the data, improving the lessons that we learn from the interventions, having our colleagues from the SDG Trust Fund telling us exactly what is the interface between the different transitions and the localization will give us a much better portfolio. So with the local 2030 coalition, we do have also a long-term objective to go from these tens of millions to hundreds of millions. And hopefully, when we'll be going to the hundreds of millions, the lessons we will learn from this exercise will be very valuable. I thank you for this time. I really need to run to another meeting, but my colleagues from UN Habitat and the Joint SDG Trust Fund are with you, and I think they will be very pleased to answer any potential question. Thank you so much for your time again, and congratulations for organizing this. And let me close also with another big thank to the Spanish government, that she's the one that she has made possible the local 2030 coalition, and of course the work we do with the localization market and the catalytic funding. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Director. And I understand also Spain is the largest contributor so far to the Trust Fund. I think this is a testimony of the leadership and the championship of the country. And thank you for the hopeful messages around the Trust Fund, the marketplace, and the opportunities for local and regional governments going forward. I understand you have to leave us. You did raise a point about the gap between planning and implementation, which you're explaining in part by budgetary limitations and considerations. And there's actually a question in the chat in relation to that, that maybe I'll direct to you, Jenny, about the disappointment that you expressed in terms of the progress in project implementation and what you think this is related towards you two. And our colleague in the chat is asking if it's the level of bureaucracy in obtaining and managing funds as one of the causes, or how do you explain this slow progress that you've mentioned in your presentation?
Well, there are many, many reasons as far as that goes. Let's just look at it from the point of view of how you get money to projects at the local level. There are a couple of issues. One, of course, is that the national governments are setting the standards and setting the agendas for what things could be done. So that's one issue. They may not be in agreement with the local government, what's doing. Number two is really the issue of institutional capacity at the local level. Capacity to create the projects that will be investable, but also the capacity to carry them out. And I'm not talking about large sophisticated cities. I'm talking about the small and medium-sized cities where technical assistance is definitely needed to go along with the kinds of course, concessional loans, blended finance, whatever tools are being used. But we need to think about upstream, getting that technical assistance there and making sure that the capacity is there, not only to create the projects, but also to execute and maintain those projects. So it's really complicated, but it is basically an issue of talent, leadership, and money.
Interesting, and we'll see in the discussion later to what extent the mechanisms and the solutions that are being proposed by the Commission, including the Green Cities Guarantee Fund, are featuring this heterogeneity in capacity and allowing for, some customization. I don't know if you wish to say something about that now or later in the discussion.
Well, actually, what I did forget to mention when I was making my presentation is how important data is. Data, not about what's needed, but data about what's successful. How you show the kinds of investments have worked out and what kind of investment works out. There's a group called GEMS that is working on creating that database, but you're not going to get investors to invest unless they can see that the track record has been good on something. So we need data in that regard too.
Excellent. So if you have questions, signal yourself. We'll move now towards our next speaker, who's also online. Really thrilled to invite my colleague Isabelle Chatry, who's heading our work at the OECD on decentralization, subnational finance, and infrastructure. Very topical issues for today's conversation, to share with you, the evidence, the data, and the flows they've been tracking across local and regional governments within the OECD UCL SDG Observatory and some of the challenges that come with that. And Isabel will stay with us for the subsequent discussion. After Isabel will maybe take a question or two if you have in relation to the presentation in particular. And then we'll hear from 3 subnational government representatives and have a Q&A session in the end. Isabel, merci, you have the floor.
Merci, thank you very much, Aziza. Good morning, everyone. So I have slides. So as next slide, as just highlighted by Eugenie, we are very far from achieving the SDGs. There are many reasons for this, but one of the main reasons is the lack of resources to implement the SDGs. So according to a recent survey, 2/3 of some national governments cited the lack of financial resources as the main challenge. In developing countries, this is a particularly important issue. There is a huge financing gap for the SDGs estimated at $3.9 trillion US. Next slide. Why is this lack of resources at the subnational level so important? It is important because of some national governments play a central role in the implementation of the SDGs. This commitment is reflected in the level of some national expenditure. Data from the World Observatory on some national finance and investment, the WOFI, shows that on average, some national governments account for around 22% of total public expenditure and 8.3% of GDP globally. In many countries, some national governments have many responsibilities related to SDG areas. You can see from the pie that 20% of some national spending goes to education, 16% to economic affairs, 11% to social protection, or 10% to health. Next slide. Some national governments also play a key role in public investment, accounting for almost 40% of public investment on average globally. And in OECD and EU countries, some national climate significant investments account for 69% of total public climate investment. Next. It is clear that the achievement of the SDGs depends heavily on progress made at the regional and local levels, or whether some national governments are struggling to secure resources. There is a financing gap which is linked to a funding gap. When I talk about the funding gap, I am referring to budgetary resources, and the financing gap refers to the difficulty in accessing borrowing. And funding and financing are closely linked. The availability of revenues, so grants, tax revenues, user charges, is one of the key elements in being creditworthy or being able to repay debt and therefore able to borrow. In short, unlocking funding is critical to unlocking financing. And this is why it is so important to have a fiscal framework that properly aligns resources with ambitions for progress on the SDGs. But that's not often the case. In many countries, some national governments face poor fiscal decentralization frameworks, resulting in unfunded or underfunded mandates, in particular in SDG areas. And as you can see from the chart, grants and subsidies, so they are the pink bars, are by far the main source of revenue for some national governments, accounting for more than half of some national revenues. And they include internationals, such as ODA, and national transfers, or whether they are insufficient to cover expenditure needs and are often unstable and unpredictable. The second source of revenue is tax revenue, but in many countries, on-source taxes or autonomous taxes are very limited. So improving some national fiscal space is therefore critical to aligning resources with the SDGs. And in our work for the G20, we have identified several options to increase and diversify funding sources. These include, for example, the development of targeted taxes. Another example is land-based financing, or how to capture increases in land value. And as shown in the OECD Lincoln Compendium, there are several types of land value capture instruments that could be further developed. A final example includes optimizing income from local government assets, for example, the use of asset leasing or asset recycling. Next slide. And then once the funding base is secure, some national governments should be given access to financing instruments. And today, we can see that some national debt financing remains underused at the global level. Some national debt is less than 10% of total public debt and around 8% of GDP. And as you can see from the chart, these percentages are much lower in low and lower middle income countries, or for example, in Africa. Indeed, in many countries, some national governments are not allowed to borrow, and access to bond issuance is even more limited, especially at the city level. And when they are allowed to borrow, cities often lack the creditworthiness and capacity to issue bonds, and access to guarantees is also a challenge. Bonds represent only 11% of some national debt globally, while bonds like sustainability bonds may be an innovative tool to finance SDGs, as shown by the city of Kitakyushu in Japan. So national governments could then allow some national governments greater flexibility in accessing borrowing. Of course, it also means that the right systems must be in place to ensure that access to debt is used prudently and sustainably. So strong fiscal rules are the necessarily corollary of new flexibilities. This will be also key to bringing together public and private resources in the form of blended finance or public-private partnerships to support projects in line with the SDGs. So then my next and final slide is to insist on the 4 elements of an enabling environment that can help mobilize both funding and financing for the SDGs. First, improving fiscal, regulatory, accounting, and budgeting frameworks, including SDGs budgeting. Second, strengthening the institutional capacity of some national government. It was said by Eugenie. Supporting effective coordination and collaboration between and also across levels of government. And finally, developing financial markets for some national government debts. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And for those of you who are not familiar with the work of the WOFI, World Observatory of Subnational Finance and Governance, I really invite you to go and surf and Google. It's a golden mine of information. There's really fantastic work done to track local and regional government expenditure and investment. And I think a lot of what Isabel said goes to the core of what we're looking at when it comes to financing the SDGs, you know, very concrete aspects, education, energy, health, water, local governance that are at the core of many of the goals, and where we see that even if there is a diversity of situations and a great heterogeneity across countries on political, administrative, and fiscal decentralizations, there seems to be a common set of challenges when it comes to funding gaps and financing gaps in these countries. And some of the solutions put forward are extremely interesting. So have a look. Isabel stays with us until the end of the session. Thank you very much. And now we'll go to the panelists, and we have the opportunity to hear from 3 representatives of local and regional entities. We'll start with Andrés Michel, who is the Secretary of Political Economy of the province of Córdoba in Argentina. We'll also hear from Thomas Becker, who is the Managing Director of the String Mega Region, and then Eider Inunciaga, the Counselor for Basque Language, Public Services and Civic Engagement in the city of Bilbao. We'll go first to you, Andrés, and we'll invite you maybe to share what Córdoba is doing in terms of strategies to implement the SDGs, but also to attract financing for the SDGs in particular. And we'll have then a second round of questions where you can elaborate a bit more on the role of the private sector and public-private partnerships. Over to you.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días. Primero voy a hacer una pequeña introducción de Córdoba. Córdoba es una provincia de 4 millones de habitantes. Está en el centro del país, en Argentina, con una diversidad productiva muy amplia. Quiero decir con esto que está enfocada en la producción de alimentos, pero también de servicios y servicios vinculados a la tecnología. En cuanto a la estrategia de la provincia, tiene que ver mucho con la conexión internacional para insertarnos en el mundo a través de nuestras cadenas globales de valor. El objetivo o los objetivos, digamos, de esta estrategia en cuanto a cumplir con los ODS, en primer lugar, obviamente es reducir la pobreza, que en nuestra agenda a nivel nacional es un nicho importante, y las desigualdades, obviamente, a través de la generación de empleo y de las inversiones en infraestructuras, y todo esto vinculado con las conexiones y las vinculaciones internacionales. Respecto del cómo estamos abordando la cuestión del financiamiento, bueno, de la manera más diversa, como se mostró previamente, no quiero redundar, pero en diversos frentes. Por un lado, organismos multilaterales, por el otro, fondos internacionales, como en el caso puntualmente vinculado a la infraestructura para la provisión de agua con fondos de saudíes, por ejemplo. Financiamiento obviamente bancario, partnerships a través del sector privado y también algunos fondos que están vinculados con aspectos más de filantropía. Así que hacemos uso de todo eso. Desde el punto de vista más instrumental, a mí me gustaría mencionar que si bien es cierto que hay un gap entre la disponibilidad de financiamiento y la necesidad de financiamiento, es decir, ese es un primer problema, hay un segundo problema que tiene que ver con cómo conectar esa oferta y demanda. Entonces, en ese sentido, desde el punto de vista de la política pública, ahí nos ayudan mucho los datos. Primero, para detectar, obviamente uno tiene una estrategia, como mencioné de manera muy resumida, para abordar y alcanzar estos objetivos, pero los tiempos de ejecución o de gestión son muy cortos. Entonces, uno tiene que ser muy eficiente en detectar esas oportunidades que conecten con esta estrategia, esta oportunidad de financiamiento. Muchas veces estas oportunidades de financiamiento no son del todo flexibles, ¿sí? En el sentido de que implementarlas requiere un gran desafío en el tiempo. Por el lado interno, es decir, lo que podemos hacer como gestión es reducir mucho los tiempos teniendo preparados los proyectos, ¿sí? Teniendo preparados los proyectos para cuando el financiamiento o estos fondos aparezcan. ¿Cómo reducir los tiempos para conectar oferta con demandas? Bueno, el estar siempre conectado con todos estos organismos que van desde el Banco Mundial, obviamente Naciones Unidas, CAFO, Corporación Andina de Fomento, el BID, CEPAL, una amplia lista que obviamente me voy a olvidar de algunos de ellos, pero esa conexión, ese diálogo fluido ayuda a reducir las brechas. Y desde el punto de vista interno, también trabajar mucho con lo que es política basada en evidencia y generar, que se mencionó por aquí, explotar más los datos que dispone el sector público. Explotar muchísimo más. Los datos siempre están subexplotados y eso permite evaluar cuáles son estos proyectos que tienen un mayor retorno interno al momento de ser ejecutados. Y, perdón, finalmente, el ciclo lo cerramos y estamos abordando mucho este punto que tiene que ver con la medición de los impactos, es decir, evaluar las políticas públicas, cerrar el ciclo. Inicia obviamente con los datos y esto implica adelantarnos porque los registros administrativos no están pensados para la evaluación de las políticas públicas. Entonces, el trabajo de llevar estos registros administrativos a que sean bases de datos que sirvan para la evaluación de la política pública es algo que nos va a dar muchísimos retornos, que ya lo está dando en el corto plazo, pero creemos que aún más en el largo plazo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, secretario. Muy interesantes los ejemplos que ilustran de cierta manera lo que estaba diciendo Jenny en términos de fuentes de financiación, pero también de brechas que nos comentó y la manera con la cual la provincia está usando los datos para mejorar y introducir, digamos, mayor eficiencia en estas oportunidades. Let's now move to our second panelist, Thomas Becker, who's the Managing Director at String Region. And I'll invite you, Thomas, to explain also to our audience what is String, and the role you're playing there in localizing the SDGs and some of the challenges you've come up or you've bumped into when it comes to financing the localization of the SDGs at mega regional level.
Thank you very much. Well, it has nothing to do with the women's underwear. It is a connotation of from the past, not important, but the brand is there now, so it's difficult to change, although a silly name. I think originally it was a string from Oslo down to Hamburg, and that's why they found the name suitable. Thank you for inviting me here. String is an organization that is consisting of 15 members, regions and cities, at the stretch, as I said, from maybe we can have the map.
Yes, there's a
back.
slide that will be projected on the
slide.
screen.
Here
we go.
Goes all the way from Oslo in Norway, through the western part of Sweden, through the center part and southern part of Denmark, and down to Hamburg. So we have 3 German members as well. It is collaboration, in particular, on 2 matters. It is on, let's say, to institutionalize that we think, and the OECD thinks, that we have an advantage in green technologies. We have a comparative advantage, I mean, industrial solutions in the green sector. And secondly, to link the region together with sustainable infrastructure, because a prerequisite for, let's say, a growth adventure is infrastructure. Again, we have been told by the wise people from the OECD. So these are our 2 priorities. We work quite closely together, these regions. And let's say we do this as, I would say, a part of a mega trend. The mega trend being that, at least in Europe, but I am being told that it is global, you see more and more cross-border and non-cross-border regional cooperation. That actually regions and cities, instead of waiting for national governments, which, for good reason, I mean, I'm not blaming national governments, for good reason, is often very, very tiresome and lengthy processes to establish different kinds of improvements when it concerns much of what is included in the SDGs. It also includes things that are not in the SDGs, of course, obviously, but most of it goes hand in hand. And let's say there is a fatigue among certain regions across the globe of waiting for the national governments. National governments obviously have a variety of stakeholders and is troubled by being forced to take all those stakeholders into consideration when deciding. Often, the regions and the cities are not, and thereby much more operational. Now, I'm not saying that this is extremely popular necessarily in capitals, because at least in Europe, let's say the organization and the organizing and the manifestation of regions together poses a challenge to governments more and more. You see the collaboration between Germany and France, Eastern France, Western Germany in the Aachen Treaty, for example, which is a state treaty. institutionalizing how you should work together, no matter what the national governments decides, almost. So that is an interesting trend, and I think I'm very happy that the OECD, in a visionary way, has taken up this trend and is working on it, because I think this we'll see much more of in the future. I could also add that the EU Commission are very fond of this kind of collaboration. If you were a little vicious, you would say that's because they get rid of the difficult national administrations there by having the regional cooperation. It's true and it's not true. It's also because actually a lot of things are happening, not least on economy. It's much easier to relate to someone that you are cross-border with or in the same vicinity than something far ahead. And therefore, it becomes often very natural that you work with your neighbors and that you compare your challenges to the challenges of your neighbors, and that you solve the problems together in comparison with somebody who is, as I said, very far away. Now, trying now to come a little closer to what you were asking me. As I said, cross-border planning, if it's cross-border, but even if it's not cross-border planning, is very difficult when it's not in the same region. And that, I think, is not only a European problem, it is more a global problem. National governments, they have a tendency of not being able to, I'm not saying they don't want to, but they are not capable of always taking into consideration, and this, of course, is very relevant if you talk about infrastructure. You know, any border in Europe, you should not plan your infrastructure without planning it together with the neighboring countries. It would be close to stupid not to do it. Nevertheless, it's happening all the time. So again, very interesting that the OECD is now eagerly working on this. The more you could tell the ministries of finance, and I know you have a special angle in there because they like you and they listen to you, the better. The better, and you should really try to use your influence there. This is not only applying to the Nordic countries, it's applying, at least in Europe, to most countries. The SDG number 9 is the one, and I'm a little ashamed of saying this, is the most relevant to the region where I come from. And I say this because we are perhaps not as challenged as many of our colleagues here on many other matters, but on infrastructure and on the capacity to work closely together with the advantages that we are having on certain industrial sectors is not sufficient at all. Everybody is working for themselves in small islands, being very afraid of the competition from the neighboring region, which is stupid, because as the OECD is telling us, where the heat is on in the future is on mega regions. It's the agglomeration economy that is the future. It is not by isolating yourself and just try to act protectionistic, because you will get nowhere with that. The future development of the economies, as far as I have understood from the masters of the OECD, is happening in the mega regions. The mega regions are the forceful thing in our future economy. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a nightmare. It sounds horrible, the word a mega region sounds as if it's very crowded and very horrible and not very well organized. It can be very well organized. It can be actually where people want to live. And in that connection, I would like to echo what someone said recently in a debate in the European Parliament. Whatever we say about the rural areas and whatever we say about not emptying the rural areas in our countries and trying to have livelihoods where people can live and stay and work, etc. The tendency for the young people is urbanization. It's been for the last 30 years, and it continues and it increases. So let's say the next generation, they want to live in cities. They want to live not necessarily in very crowded cities, but in a cities where they can have a social life, where they can work, where they can fulfill their dreams. And even if we have this romantic, or my generation have this romantic picture of the countryside and everybody should live there, they don't want to live there. So that is quite clear. And I hope this was. Do you want me to go closer into?
We'll go back to a second round after. I think this was
Thank you.
excellent for the first
Thank
intervention. Thank you so much, Thomas. And I think having you at the table is the best illustration of two really strong points we've been making in this work on localizing the SDGs in the past 5 to 7 years. The first one being that there is a continuum between the city and the national government. And I think, as you rightly say, the regional government and their role, not only in terms of economic development, but also in terms of rural-urban linkages and balanced polycentricity in the quality of urbanization has been underplayed, also because mayors tend to be way more vocal and visible than governors. So the role of the region and regional policy is really something we're calling upon. And then the fact that many of these challenges actually don't stop at national boundaries, and this cross-border perspective, given the transboundary spillovers of the SDGs, is extremely topical. And the fact some regions from across countries pool resources goes to the scale point that was raised earlier, and also helpfully becomes an enabler to access financing. Let's see how the financial architecture can accommodate this type of what remains a special animal, but is indeed gaining a lot of traction globally. That's something we're monitoring very closely. Thank you, Thomas. We'll go back to you for a second round. And let me close this first one with Eider Inunciaga from the city of Bilbao, in charge of the Agenda 2030 and internationalization. Eider, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aziza, and well, egunon, eguerdion, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. Well, I was asked a couple of questions, so in this first round, I think I have to answer what the main obstacles for financing at the city level are. Financing the localization of SDGs, of course. So I think that throughout the morning, most of the overall difficulties that we find when financing the localization of SDGs have already been posed. Those global challenges are repeated, of course, at the European level, and how not, at the city level as well. So I would say that we are in front of a complex financial situation, but it is as complex as necessary, meaning that financing the localization of SDGs is what will get us concrete results on the final achievement of the SDGs and on improving that 15% of the achievement that we have gone so far. Regarding the hurdles, some of them have already been explained by Isabella and Eugenie, of course. And I would say that for a city council, we have two types of obstacles, of hurdles. One would be on the internal side, and another aspect would be the external side of the difficulties. So regarding the internal side, of course, we have limited resources. Cities normally lack the tax base or the budgetary resources that are needed to first fund the projects, and secondly, as Stefanos was saying, to maintain those projects, because it's not only about developing the infrastructure, it's also about maintaining the infrastructures afterwards. The second internal obstacle that we find is something that we have mentioned here today as well, was the capacity building. So we have been talking about the leadership all throughout these years, and I think that now that we've got the leaders, and in our case, for instance, our mayor totally involved and committed to the achievement of the SDGs and contributing to the achievement of the SDGs at the local and global sphere, now we have realized that in many cases, we lack the expertise and the experience to develop and manage complex SDG-related projects. So this can make it difficult for investors, and it can be difficult for us also to implement projects in an effective manner. The third internal obstacle that we are finding is the data deficit, because we are not used to registering the information in this manner. And in this aspect, for us, it has been a very positive experience to develop our voluntary local review, because we are getting our technicians kind of used to and accustomed to work in this, using this language. So I think that's a very good, and I think it's a good practice for all the local governments also to apply in order to work towards the data gathering improvement. And then regarding the external obstacles, for me, the most important one is that we've got a fragmented landscape in front of us. There are many different actors involved in the financing of the SDGs. And so we're talking, Eugenie has explained it, of course, exquisitely, but state governments, international donors, private investors, NGOs, etc., etc. So that fragmented landscape makes it kind of difficult sometimes to cooperate and coordinate when we have a common goal. And I would just like to finish by saying that despite all the obstacles, of course, we have a number of very innovative financing mechanisms. Some of them have already been presented, such as the public-private partnerships, the crowdfunding, or the impact investment. And yesterday, I was attending this event with the private sector in Bilbao, and they were discussing and debating about the ESG criteria and the EU regulation and how it impacts the private sector. And some data was presented there, and I positively received a specific stat regarding the percentage of investment funds in the European Union that are taking into consideration sustainability criteria. So nowadays, this percentage is 15%. So 15% of the investment funds are taking into account sustainability criteria, and I think that this can be extrapolated to the SDG criteria as well. And they are expecting by the end of 2025, this percentage to go up to 41 to 57%. So in a year and a half, the private sector will be investing much more in projects that will take into consideration this criteria. And I think this is very positive. Thank you, Aziza.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's go to a second round, and then we'll ring fence 15 minutes for Q&As before we break for lunch. And I'll go back to you, Andres. And now for the three of you, we're going to dive really into the concrete way you are attracting, catalyzing finance for your localization efforts. And I'll ask maybe Andres to elaborate a bit on the strategies that Cordoba is using to attract the private sector and to build these public-private partnerships that were just mentioned right now by Eder. You have the floor.
Gracias. Respecto a la conexión con el sector privado, bueno, debo decirles que ya es una tradición y está institucionalizado en la provincia de Córdoba desde hace bastante tiempo la participación público-privada. Incluso tenemos 3 agencias, una de innovación, otra de competitividad y la otra vinculada al desarrollo y a la promoción de las exportaciones, donde en el board participan los privados. Entonces, la conexión entre el privado y el sector público ayuda a cortar estos gaps, a identificar principalmente oportunidades, porque la velocidad o la vinculación que tiene el sector privado es totalmente diferente, y eso nos ayuda a mejorar y diseñar las políticas públicas y a ir rápidos a donde están esas oportunidades. Desde el punto de vista más instrumental, y de hecho voy a aprovechar esta visita aquí en el País Vasco para visitar algunas políticas de clústeres, y estamos todo el tiempo analizando e incorporando buenas prácticas, ¿sí? También estaré en Cataluña, y es la política de clúster la que nos ayuda también a identificar dónde están estas oportunidades, a estar innovando todo el tiempo junto con el sector privado y la academia, y principalmente a identificar oportunidades como... Voy a mencionar algún ejemplo, esto más a nivel ciudad, en lo que tiene que ver con economía circular. Identificamos que en la provincia de Córdoba hay cerca de 100 empresas que brindan algún tipo de solución vinculada a la economía circular. Ejemplo, medición de huella de carbono en algunos eventos, espectáculos y demás. Y observamos que junto al sector privado, con todas las herramientas que tenemos del sector público, los podemos ayudar a conseguir mercados internacionales. Estas soluciones son soluciones globales. Entonces, es en el doble sentido que esto sucede, y de esa manera, obviamente que podemos aumentar y mejorar la competitividad de estas empresas. Respecto del uso de los datos también a nivel ciudad, eso cuando tuvimos la participación en el municipio, en la ciudad de Córdoba, lo que tiene que ver con movilidad, la movilidad genera muchísimos datos, y también las soluciones que las empresas encuentran ahí son soluciones globales, y el sector público puede ayudar a escalarlas. Otro ejemplo tiene que ver con un fondo especial para promover la compra de equity de algunas startups vinculadas más a lo que es GovTech. Y de nuevo, cuando una solución se aplica en una ciudad y funciona, esos emprendedores también encuentran la posibilidad de poder escalar sus proyectos y brindar esas soluciones, obviamente monetizándolas en otros lugares, ¿no? Y ayudado con la coordinación pública-pública. El diálogo público-público tiene una potencia de conexión que el sector privado por ahí no la puede conseguir, o si la consigue a un costo de tiempo mucho más elevado.
Gracias. Thank you very much, Andres. And let me now turn to you. Thomas, you did mention infrastructure and the transition to net zero as being your priorities. And we know there are a number of debates ongoing in the mega region about railway infrastructure, capital intensive and costly types of infrastructure that are supposed to generate co-benefits also in terms of achieving some of the goals. How are you staging these conversations and the financing that goes with it? How do you align planets and build consensus on the need to go forward with some of these infrastructure?
Thank you. Could I have the map again, please, to
We'll put the
illustrate?
slides.
I will
Go
just
ahead.
mention one example, which is. Okay, meanwhile.
Go ahead, yeah.
Meanwhile, when I started in String, I wanted, or I should get used to saying we wanted to find a project which was within the SDGs, which should fill a gap and which should be concrete for the taxpayers. Those three conditions. And we found out that in the EU, we are going to phase out diesel trucks. We were hoping in 35, I think some lorry producers managed to extend that a little, but in 2035, more or less, there will be no diesel trucks left in the EU. Now, that's a challenge for the transport sector. You can imagine. In 2035, when it concerns transport investment, is tomorrow. So what is the alternative? The long-term alternative for all of Europe is goods on track, away from road, over to track and ship. They are highest up in the climate pyramid. They are, with no competition, much more climate friendly, both transport forms, than what we are using today. But until that happens, we know that establishing a new railway is a lengthy project and it takes time. We need something else, and we can't use diesel. And electric trucks, however we turn it around, cannot today, with the existing technology, carry 48 tons over a mountain. It's not possible. The battery is done by 50 kilometers, and then you have to reload for 2 hours, and it doesn't work. The alternative is hydrogen. And the alternative today, I'm not saying that there might not be other technologies in the future, etc. We live in a dynamic time, but at some stage you have to say, okay, this is the technology we have and we have to use it. That's the future for now in Europe, the intermediate future. But in that region, from Oslo to Hamburg and from Hamburg backwards, you cannot load a hydrogen truck. It doesn't exist. So we in String decided to try to establish 12 or 14, whoever you talk to, hydrogen filling stations at a cost of 4 million euro per station. 2 of them in Germany, 3 or 4 in Denmark, 5 in Sweden, and 2 in Norway, and organized by String. Now, what is the relation to this and to get financing for SDGs? Well, in fact, it's very relevant, because what we tried to say is, of course, the public sector cannot finance this. It's supposed to be a commercial business. It's supposed to be commercialized. So why should we? What the public side can do, however, is to come with some seed money to institutionalize the project, to get investors together, to organize that you apply for funding in the EU, which by itself is a science. I mean, you need a PhD to apply in the EU for a project, at least. All of that together and facilitating is what we do in String. We have had some public funding, some private funding, but the actual building of the stations and the hardware is done by commercial entities who will own the stations and run them and hopefully earn money on them. Now, there is a difficulty right now in Europe because it's a chicken and egg. They say there are no trucks, hydrogen trucks. They say there are no market, there are no stations, so everybody's waiting for everybody. Now, however, it seems to the barrier is breaking, and at least in Germany, you can see a very rapid development, which also will happen in the other countries. So this we are undertaking in String as an organization. It's very concrete. It's something that people understand. They see a loading station where you can load trucks. It's very understandable. Now, that was a concrete example. Let me just, Madam Chair, give me 1 minute more, because when you talk about, we have many bottlenecks in this stretch. We have the lack of bridges in the sounds. We have lousy train connections in some areas. We have a challenge with, let's say, the new security situation in Europe, whereby NATO will need to transport troops from the west of the peninsula of Jutland in Denmark via Zealand over Sweden and perhaps to the Baltics and to Finland. Just to give you an example, one soldier deployed in the East demands one container of goods, is equal to one container of transported goods. One soldier. So if 10,000 soldiers are going to be deployed from the west coast of Jutland and are be landing there and go over, you need to transport 10,000 containers. That cannot be done with the existing infrastructure by no means. I know, and our politicians understand that. The argument that we have started to use now very much is not only the NATO argument, which is of course is a eye opener. Let's face it. This is really something that has massaged the political level at all levels, I think, in all of our countries. But a very useful argument, and where we are hoping to get some, let's say, more scientific arguments from the OECD at a later stage, is the cost of inaction. Do not talk to us about what the price, the enormous cost of this and that will be. Turn it around and say, how much does it cost you if you do not do it? If you don't do anything, how much will you be paying for not being part of the new development? And then try to quantify that, obviously. And that can be done. It's doable, and that has given us, let's say, a lot of leeway, that discussion, and we are going to, let's say, deep dive into the OECD, into that. And final point, Madam Chair, alternative financing, when it concerns the financing of SDGs, do not look at necessarily traditional, let's say, governmental funding, because we have a tendency of saying, okay, if we are talking about ditches, if we're talking about trains or bigger infrastructure, we always look at the government and say this has to be financed at the traditional way by taxpayers. We have discovered that there is nothing more the pension funds love than institutional infrastructure financing. It's secure, it's long-term, it's secured often by the government, it serves a relative good purpose. It's nothing to do with tobacco or weapons or some things like that. So I think in the past, a lot of us have often missed an opportunity to get that money into the game. So always look at these major institutional funds when it concerns, let's say, the more commercial parts or semi-commercial parts of fulfilling or investments for SDGs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Over to you, Eider, and I think you are going to illustrate a bit this multi-level governance dynamics with the national government in Spain, also building on what you said earlier.
Indeed, thank you, Aziza. So for us, just being the host city for the Secretariat of the Local 2030 Coalition is something that, first of all, gives us a huge responsibility sense, but it also helps us position as a city where localization of SDGs happen. So we believe that that is something that can help us. As I said, it also gives us a big burden of responsibility. So on the one hand, we are directly putting a big part of our budget into the localization of SDGs through the Secretariat. And we believe that the marker that has been set for those projects in the overall fund that will mark the projects that localize SDGs, I think that's going to be very positive, and it's a huge qualitative change in the funding sector and perspective. But not only that, for us, having collaborated this very strong alliance that we hold between the Spanish ministries, the Basque government, Bilbao City Council, and the BBK Foundation that is representing somehow the private sector, is a great example that definitely, well, we believe could be replicated elsewhere. And that's exactly what we were talking about when discussing about the 3 PPP, the public-private partnerships. So the Basque ecosystem is an absolutely enabling ecosystem for these things to happen. And as I mentioned, even the private sector is very committed to this. And well, this makes things a bit easier for all of us to collaborate and to direct our budget efforts towards that direction. And in our case, linked to that responsibility that we have as a host city of the Secretariat, we have developed an action plan on how to localize the SDGs in our city. I'm not going to get deep into the action plan, but I would just like to mention the 4 main pillars of this action plan. Taking into consideration that the last pillar is focused on the attraction of investment, which is the topic of this part of the session. So the first pillar is focused on building a conscious citizenship, active citizenship. We all know that awareness raising is fundamental, but we do not only want to raise awareness, but we want people to be empowered and to be just part of this whole process of engaging with the achievement of the SDGs. The second pillar is focused on generating the skills that are needed, that we mentioned, that are an obstacle somehow in order to implement this project. So we want to generate the skills in both public and private organizations in order to provoke these multi-stakeholder alliances. And then the third step would be to co-create the process, to co-create those walking paths that we will walk together between the different stakeholders, the stakeholders from the quadruple helix, in order to define projects, to gather the data we need, to develop technology, to innovate in the processes, etc. And this will bring us to the 4th pillar, which is going to be the attraction of public and private investment towards the localization of the project. So for us, having a clear action plan that takes into account the different agents, the reality of the city, is something necessary. And in our case, as I mentioned, especially taking into consideration that we are in the focus somehow worldwide, having the Secretariat, well, we are putting loads of efforts on that. So thank you, Aziza.
Thank you so much, Haider. And this closes the intervention from the panelists. I still want us to go for lunch in 10 minutes, so I'll take a few interventions, invite you to introduce yourself. There is one online which I'm throwing, if any of the speaker wants to react on whether you've come up to a conclusion as to which form of public-private partnership is the most effective and sustainable to finance and maintain city-level infrastructure in particular. So if some of you have experience or feedback on that, whether you are a panelist or just a participant in the roundtable, that's most welcome. So I'll go first with the Committee of the Regions. I see 2, 3 flags here online. Signal yourself. Maybe we'll take 3, 4 questions in a row and then ask speakers to respond. I'll ask you please to be sharp and to the point. Go ahead, please, Audrey.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to echo the contribution of Councillor Nunziaga for Bilbao about external and internal barriers to to finance SDGs, and at EU level, what the European Committee of the Regions is doing is that it is trying to connect the dots between European Commission and the regions and cities to really know about the available funding possibilities. And bringing together different services from the European Commission that do not talk to each other usually to really present quite an overview of funding possibilities. We will organize an event on 4th of June, and I can only promote it and tell you to log on and listen to it if you are an EU regions and cities. And there is also the key issue of financing from investment bank and from the private sector. And here we will also have the European Investment Bank presenting how it works with SDGs, even if it's not its core issue. And I think this can be really interesting for, let's say, secondary cities who do not know all the possibilities that are available for them from the European Investment Bank. And we will also be very lucky to have example from regions and cities on how they finance SDG localization, including the Basque Country and Tallinn, who will present innovative mechanisms to finance SDG localization. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Audrey. And maybe we can put the link to the event online for those who are online and liaise with Audrey over the lunchtime. If you wish to know more on the 4th of June as well, we'll take great pleasure in participating as OECD. Verena, for the city of Bonn, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Aziza. I have a comment or a question also to Eugenie. Looking into the German example, for instance, in my city, if we look into sustainable transformation, our municipal enterprises, our public enterprises are one of the biggest assets. And if we heard a lot about PPPs today. And for instance, Bonn is in the lucky position we own our public transport, we own our grid for water, electricity, etc. And that now gives us the possibility to actually implement the changes that are required. Bonn wants to become climate neutral by 2035. And it's actually our city council that sets the screws in these public enterprises. Now look, and this is not the situation in many of German cities who sold away or gave away their public infrastructure in PPPs. So my question would be, or my comment, I think there is legislative framework is important. And Eugenie, you mentioned also the risks that come with private funding. So what is the framework that allows this to put this into a good position? And also to ensure, for instance, if we look at some of the examples, I know this from France, but also from Chile, where a lot of public infrastructure has been given 100% into private hands, that the question of access for low-income households is becoming a crucial one because public assets are sold then. And maybe you can comment a little bit on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I direct to you, if you allow me, that question on whether there is an ideal model or more successful, effective, sustainable model of PPP for city level types of infrastructure. If you've come across things in the research, I have my own views and can add to that, but let you go first.
That's scary if you have your own views, but anyway, I think, well, two questions there. First of all, let me go with the bond issue. And I think you're extremely fortunate that you have control of your public infrastructure and therefore control of its revenues, and being able to have dedicated revenues towards the financing of particular projects under the different sectors, as you described, is really quite ideal. In terms of public-private partnerships, lots of issues, obviously, but the need for the public sector to understand the sophistication of the kinds of financing that's necessary is really important. So the technical expertise to develop the partnerships is critical, and having the ability to make sure that all parts of the population are protected in these kinds of agreements, I think is what was being discussed earlier, that if you don't have control over that, the exigencies of profit can get in the way of trying to provide the public service. So it's having the skill and talent on the public side to negotiate a fair and just transition is critical to PPPs.
Yeah, couldn't agree more to that. I think there's been a lot of experience in Argentina also about public-private partnerships, and I worked myself extensively in the field of water and sanitation, and I think some of the conclusions indeed go to that point that it's not only about ownership or whether it's public or private, it's also about the framework conditions that are in place, the flexibility that you inject also. I mean, we're moving away from these 20, 30-year concession contracts. They, you know, are very difficult to accommodate when you have high institutional, financial, and political risks, and also evolutions in the very needs that places have, you know, for financing and operation. And I think the point you made about the capacity and also the fact that you should, within the public authority, also retain the regulatory prerogative and the capacity to monitor and provide the checks and balance in case of private sector participation for it to work is essential. Thank you for that. I think we have the gentleman over there that I invite you to introduce yourself, and then I'll go to String, Bilbao City Council, and we close for lunch, please.
Yeah, hello, I'm Nicolas Garrigue. I'm a senior consultant with the UNDP, working on local governance, local development, and SDG localization. By consequence, my work entirely focuses on fragile and crisis-affected countries. I realize it's a bit outside maybe of the focus of this roundtable, although there is a session on decentralized cooperation in the afternoon. According to the latest States of Fragility report by the OECD on fragility, we are talking about 60 countries in the world, and the number is increasing. 23% of the population and 80% of the world poverty is also found in these countries. So what we can see, of course, is an increasing falling back, reversal on SDGs pathways in most of these countries, increasing gap in terms of capacity to actually drive SDG pathways to implement SDG localization. These are situations that are also getting very near to us when we think about Ukraine, for example. So maybe I think a lot of the issues, and there are commonality in issues, of course, between what we see in OECD countries and in some of these countries in terms of capacities, mechanisms, and some solutions should also work. But my question maybe is to you, Jenny, is really on the financing side. I mean, looking at the slide, you had a lot of these financing sources, especially when we talk about loans and bonds and so forth, are almost unthinkable in many of the fragile countries. There are huge challenges on the fiscal space. There are huge public financial management issues. Donors are also very, of course, risk adverse in many ways. And what we see is that there is definitely a lack of, maybe we need to go to more non-conventional financing mechanisms. Maybe there has to be, some creativity brought into what sort of financing mechanisms can be used by local governments, which are very often completely, in those settings, completely marginalized by the central government. And have really no means, very difficulties to reach any sort of financing. I was last year in Lebanon, working closely with UNDP in Lebanon, trying to set together the strategy and program to support SDG localization in spite of the huge, horrendous crises that the country is going through. When you speak about SDGs, it seems like a luxury. But at the same time, local governments are left with they've lost almost 100% of the state funding due to the economic crisis. The country has lost 50% of its GDP in 3 years. And you see a lot of the municipalities, or the most maybe best connected one, manage to survive on remittances, on attracting philanthropists, Lebanese philanthropist funding, in trying to channel some of the remittances flowing into the country towards local services and SDG priorities. Lebanon has the highest rate of remittances as part of the GDP, but many other countries face that too. I mean, rely on that. And my question is, whether this has been studied for fragile countries as a potential to tap into. I mean, countries like many other countries rely on remittances for the survival. And what sort of non-conventional other financing means could also be crowdfunding, could be fast-tracked. Otherwise, we're facing countries that are nowhere near reaching any of the SDG targets by 2030.
Thank you. Point taken on the heterogeneity, Jenny. And there's a lot of work done also within the OECD's Development and Cooperation Directorate on remittances and finance from domestic resource mobilization in the developing countries. But Jenny, go ahead.
I think you're really getting at something that's even greater, which is basically what are the development pathways for fragile economies. And traditionally, our thoughts have been, the economic development thoughts have been on trying to focus on manufacturing. And this just is not what is the pathway today. The other pathways are what are the kinds of resources that might exist. And you've talked about the remittances, very, very important. What kinds of assets that cities might have that could be used, that land, for example, which was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers, trying to think about how to gather those assets to gain the kinds of funding that's needed, but also real important structural issues in the enabling situation within the country itself, that the cities are totally dependent on intergovernmental transfers, and that does not, they're not regular, they're not enough. And so it's a much bigger problem than just how to deal with fragile cities and fragile economies.
Good. Ada and Thomas, did you want to react, Thomas, to your flag was up, so just give you a chance if
Just two quick things. Firstly, I forgot to say if someone in this group is planning doing, let's say, infrastructure stretches cross-border or non-cross-border, please call us. We will give you some friendly and cost-free advice because it's a certain skill of working cross-border. Most of you know that. Another thing is related to what Eugene just said. I mean, let me foster an idea to the OECD here. There is a political force in this regionalization that I spoke of, in particular when it concerns the SDGs. It's very different in different parts of the world. I'm well aware of that. I'm now getting confused here, but can you kill that? Sorry. I think someone should take upon themselves, and I would say, I know that you are always afraid of such things in the OECD, but I have seen for a while now a very interesting interest from many regions and cities to not only share experience, because experience sharing, that's that's elastics in meters, but more to organize themselves internationally in order to be able to fulfill those SDGs that could be fulfilled very easily without waiting for national prioritizations. Do you understand where I'm coming from? And I see a political, economical vacuum right now there. Nobody is picking it up internationally to actually bring together. You do it in a let's say intellectual way. You do it from a research angle, but practically to bring regions and cities together that would like to at least do those SDGs that could have been done easily without waiting. And it's an idea that I've been working with for a while. I would just like to echo here that I see the OECD as the right place to either do it, but I think you would be reluctant to do so, or to encourage others to do it, because this is a gap. This is an existing political gap, and it's not because there is a lot of will against it. It's just not done. It's not picked up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And I think this point about the critical mass for low-hanging fruits and the incremental process that local and regional governments can also trigger and lead by example is very much at the core of the roundtable and this work. Thank you all so much. And please join me with a big round of applause for all the speakers. I have to close the round here. I hope this was insightful to scope the financing needs, to acknowledge the diversity, to map the key financing players and mechanisms, and to frame some of the conditions that need to be put in place to unlock capacity. And I see hands being shaken there, so tell me what is ongoing.
It's just that we missed Bilbao.
And yeah, no, but she said she's
It's
fine.
okay? Yes, okay.
Don't worry. We're on top of it, so we're good. Thank you to those who are online as well. We'll break now for lunch. We'll give ourselves 15 minutes, so slightly less than an hour. It's 20 to 2, so we'll be here at 2:30. So we'll try to, that's the aspirational value, and maybe we'll manage to start 5 to 10 minutes later. So enjoy the lunch and see you in the afternoon. We should be back on time for those of you who are following online. Thank you very much and enjoy food.